It's so great to have such a handy IT team here, so I really appreciate you being here. Thank you for that. So on your screen, I just have just a couple of websites, just as a reminder, as I mentioned before, if you need to, if there is an issue that is raised or that you feel at all triggered in any way, please feel free to reach out to the appropriate person in your school, or Megan and I are happy to take any questions at the end of the presentation. Just a quick reminder that there has been some changes that NESA have made, and Child Protection Professional Learning is now considered elective PD, so that's where it will fall under, and just ensure that you have your attendance recorded today as well. Okay, let's jump straight into it. So most of you would know that New South Wales is a very heavily legislated state in Australia in terms of child protection, which is absolutely a fantastic thing. However, it can be a little bit challenging at times. Challenging in the sense that we need to be aware of what are our reporting obligations, what are we required to do when a child protection concern arises. Now, you might be there thinking, oh, that's not my role and, you know, that's not my responsibility. But it is important that you are aware of what the framework looks like, because what your responsibility is to raise concerns. Whenever there's a concern about a student or a concern about a colleague, you do need to know where to report and how to report that. So we've got the four main pieces of legislation up on your screen. We've got the Children and Young Persons Care and Protection Act, the Crimes Act, the Child Protection Working with Children Act, and the Children's Guardian Act. Now, the Children's Guardian Act is our newest act. It commenced on the 1st of March 2020, and it's probably one of the most relevant ones, because whenever there's an allegation raised in terms of reportable conduct, and for you as an employee of the school, this is where your school is required to take action. So under Part 4 of this Act, that's what triggers an investigation, reporting to the Office of the Children's Guardian. Now, this is going to be a brief overview. So what I'll do is I'll just take some time to look at our Child and Young Persons Care and Protection Act. Now, the reason why I'm picking to drill into this Act a little more is because all of you in your role are mandatory reporters. So under Section 23 of the Act, whenever there is a risk of significant harm concern for a child or young person in relation to their safety, welfare and well-being, you are required to raise that concern with the appropriate person in your school. And what we often, or what we do advise our schools to do, is to follow a centralised reporting model. Now, what I mean by that is, as a mandatory reporter, you are going to fulfil your obligation to report that concern. If you report that concern on to the appropriate person in your school, who will then report it on to your head. So it's really important that that information is held in a centralised location. Now, why is that? Because every little bit of information is critical. We don't want information sitting in individual silos or departments. So once your head has all that information, they're able to make a really good, thorough assessment for what's going on for that particular child or young person and decide whether a risk of significant harm report is required. And where that report is sent to is to the Department of Communities and Justice. Under this Act, we also have a really important piece of legislation, which is the Chapter 16A. So Chapter 16A allows for prescribed bodies to exchange information in relation to the safety, welfare and well-being of children. Now, the reason why this legislation is so effective is because it overrides privacy legislation. So what that means is, if we have a child, a student that comes to our school and we notice concerns about that student, we are able to seek information about that student from the previous school, or from the police, or from a medical practitioner. And the reason why that's so effective is because really it's about safety. So keeping children and young people safe. So as a prescribed body, every single school in New South Wales, regardless of what sector you're a part of, is a prescribed body. We're able to use that legislation and seek that information to help us conduct an assessment for that child or young person. So if it meets that criteria, safety, welfare and wellbeing, absolutely, we can request or we can provide information. Being mindful that it's not about seeking information to do with their academic records or anything like that. It has to relate to the safety, welfare and wellbeing. Okay, so moving on to the Crimes Act. Now, the Crimes Act, again, I've just chosen to drill in a little bit because we've got some new offences that have come into play here. Now, obviously, the Crimes Act has to do with anything involving criminality and children. And it's really important to know that if we become aware as a school of a situation that involves a serious indictable offence, that we don't have any discretion about reporting to police. So we need to report that information on to police. Now, some people might think, what about if the alleged victim or our student doesn't want that reported, or the family says, no, I don't want that reported? We can't not report to police. This is a really critical key message that came from the inquiry that we had almost 10 years ago now, the Royal Commission inquiry. So what they found was that schools were failing to report to police, failing to report serious child abuse. So if we become aware of a serious indictable offence, for example, an assault, we need to report that on to police. Now, it's important to understand that as a school, we're not the only, we're not the only organisation responsible for child safety or child protection. We have to share that responsibility with our community partners, and police are one of our biggest community partners. So we should ideally have a really good working relationship with our police. Our local area command should know that we're here, that we're a school. We should have a police liaison officer that our head and our executive staff can easily pick up the phone and say, listen, we've got an issue, an incident that we need to report on to you. Now, as you can see on your screen, what's come into effect is failing to report child abuse to police, failing to protect a child from abuse. Now, these are recommendations that came from the Royal Commission. As I mentioned, they wanted to expand and strengthen the child abuse powers in New South Wales. So police can now charge a person for failing to report child abuse to police. And in fact, that doesn't just mean adults working in a school setting, that's all adults in New South Wales, if they fail to report child abuse to police, and also failing to protect children from abuse. So that's a little bit more specific in terms of your organisation or school setting. So if you're aware that someone presents a risk to a student in terms of child abuse, and you fail to, and it's your duty or your responsibility to report that, and you negligently fail to do that, then you can also be up for an offence. Now, just quickly also mentioning the grooming offences that have also been broadened. Now, the reason why this has been broadened is an acknowledgement of how the grooming process works, that it's a very insidious, manipulative process. So we know when a person who is seeking to offend against a child is grooming a child, they're not only going to groom that child, they're going to groom everyone in that child's environment. So they're going to groom the adults around them, the teacher, the parents. And what we now have is the ability for our police to charge a person grooming an adult to get access to a child, which is fantastic. So, we really want to see the police being able to have those broader powers to stop that grooming process happening. Under this Act, we also have Section 73 that is really important for you to know about because it affects you in a school setting. So we know that in New South Wales, the age of consent for, who remembers what the age of consent is in New South Wales? Just shout it out. 16, yeah. So the age of consent in New South Wales is 16. However, if you're in a special care relationship, so everyone that works in a school is going to be in a special care relationship, that age of consent is raised under the age of 18. So that means if there is an incident that involves a relationship or other inappropriate contact with a student, that you can be charged with that offence. Again, broadening our child abuse powers and strengthening the police ability to protect children. And just quickly, before I hand over to Meg, it's important to know, and this is new, that the failure to protect and failure to report offences has also been added
our main skill. So that occurred, that's under the Children's Guardian Act of 2019, and that came into effect in 2020. So it also, what has recently happened within that scheme is that New South Wales have now adopted the National Principles for Child Safe Organisation. So they are the New South Wales Child Safe Standards. So it's now actually all schools must incorporate those into their policies and procedures within a school. And often they're already there, but it's now become legislated that that must occur. And finally, the definition of who is an entity that must report a reportable conduct matter to the Office of the Children's Guardian has been expanded. So let's look a little bit more at what is a reportable allegation. So a reportable allegation is an allegation that an employee has engaged in conduct that may be reportable conduct. As Marie said earlier, we do tell everyone that, you know, within the school, it is your duty to actually report any concern that you may have observed to the principal or to the head of school. It is then up to them to consider two really important questions. So, is the person against whom the complaint was made considered an employee of the school according to the legislation? And is it alleged that the person has engaged in conduct that may be considered reportable conduct? And I'm going to go through the reportable conduct categories a little bit later. And so just remember, it's really important to remember as well that anything you observe or hear that may, you know, be a concern about an employee's conduct doesn't require proof to actually notify the Office of the Children's Guardian. It just needs to be alleged that there is conduct that's occurred that might be reportable conduct, or even a belief that something has occurred. And it's now, one of the changes that's occurred as well is it's now a reportable allegation. We used to call it a reportable conduct investigation, reportable conduct matter, but it now is just an allegation that needs to be notified. And then it's the outcome of the investigation that determines whether that conduct was reportable conduct or not. Okay, and I'm going to now talk more about the criteria that you'd be looking at when you're assessing whether or not it is an allegation of reportable conduct. So there are three key elements that are needed to assess an allegation to see whether it meets the criteria for reportable conduct. And earlier, the allegation was about a person who is a current employee of the school or was at the time that the alleged conduct occurred, that the behaviour described constitutes reportable conduct, or there's a conviction against the person that constitutes reportable conduct, or that the conduct occurred with someone, and that the conduct occurred with someone who was a child, so under the age of 18 years, according to the Children's Guardian legislation, at the time of the alleged incident. So that does mean that we do get historical reportable allegations, but the incident or the conduct occurred when that person was a child at the school. And as I sort of alluded to before, allegations may not always be really clear and black and white in their appearance of whether or not it's reportable conduct, because you might hear it from an anonymous source, you might hear it as a rumour, or it could come via something more formal like a complaint. So now I'm going to go through the definitions of each of the reportable conduct categories. As you can see, there are 7 of them. And they have changed somewhat. Some of the categories have changed in their definitions since the Children's Guardian Act was introduced. And I'm going to just outline what those changes are. So the first one is sexual offence. And that means an offence of a sexual nature under a law of the state, another territory or the Commonwealth committed against, with or in the presence of a child. And again, a child in this case is under the age of 18. And that can include sexual touching of a child, a grooming offence, or production or dissemination of child abuse material. The only changes really to that category, or what's included in the definition within that category, is what Maria talked about before within the Crimes Act. So now those special care offences would also be included as a sexual offence. Moving on to sexual misconduct, that means conduct with, towards, or in the presence of a child that A, must have some sexual element to it, so it must be sexual in nature, and it's not a sexual offence. So one of the things that changed with the introduction of the Children's Guardian Act is they actually removed the crossing professional boundaries from that definition. So they made the threshold for sexual misconduct a little bit higher. Unless, of course, if there is a matter of crossing professional boundaries that includes an explicitly sexual aspect to it. And Maria is actually going to expand a little bit more on that difference, because it can get quite confusing, I think, when we're trying to work out where exactly conduct fits. But she'll just go through more, what is a sexual offence, what is sexual misconduct, and where does crossing professional boundaries now fit within the scheme. Okay, sorry about that. So next one we're going to look at is ill treatment of a child, and that means conduct towards a child that is unreasonable, seriously inappropriate, improper, inhumane, or cruel. Now, as you can even hear by the wording in that, that's quite a high threshold. So that's just not, getting angry or upset at a child as a one-off incident. That's really ongoing excessive demands of a particular child, or degrading comments or behaviour towards a specific child, and using inappropriate forms of behaviour management. So that might be, standing a child in the corner for an entirety of a lesson on one leg or something like that. Quite unusual and outside what you would usually professionally use within your career. Then neglect of a child means a significant failure to provide adequate, proper food, supervision, nursing, clothing, medical aid or lodging for the child that causes or is likely to cause harm to a child. And it has to be by a person with responsibility for that child, or an authorised carer of the child, or, as is applicable here, if it's a child who's in your care as an employee of the school. So examples of that can be failure to protect a child from abuse, or exposing a child to a harmful environment where you know that they're likely or could be harmed in that situation. Emotional or psychological harm includes behaviour that causes significant emotional or psychological harm to that child. And it really, that's also another very high threshold. So it really has to be that the behaviour towards the child has to be directly linked to what they're experiencing. So you may be a child who is displaying behaviour patterns that are out of character, or aggressive behaviour, or anxiety or self-harming behaviour, but it really has to be linked to the conduct. So it can't just be if your child already has, difficulties day to day, that's not going to come within the scheme. But it is if there's a pattern of behaviour towards the child that has been assessed by a professional, is actually directly linked to that behaviour.
Act. So what that means for school is that we will see that schools will be required to implement the child safe standards, and as Meg said, it's a more formalised approach. So schools will be required to implement the standards within your whole school culture of safety. Now, they are embedded into the Act, and so what we'll see is that the child safe standards are going to be the primary framework that we are going to use in New South Wales to drive child safe practices. Now, there is an acknowledgement that there has to be some flexibility as to how schools implement the child safe standards. And what I mean by that is that every single school is going to do this slightly differently, depending on your size, your resources, the types of interaction that you have with your students. So Covenant Christian School will be doing slightly different to, say, a city school, or say, a school just, down the road. Everyone's going to do it slightly differently. Now, the good thing to know is that most schools in the independent sector are already doing this and doing it well. You've already got really strong policies and procedures in place. You are already aware of your child safe practices, and you in fact are doing this. It's just that it's been formalised now. So I'll just put the child safe standards up on your screen so you can just take a couple of minutes to read. So like I said, having a look at those child safe standards, you can see that, yep, absolutely, we are all over child safety being embedded in our governance and culture. What the Office of the Children's Guardian would like to see is that we can express that child safety and our commitment to child safety is there. So that might mean that in our school communication, on our website, or however you communicate, we might want to put a statement up there saying, we are committed to child safety. We expect everyone that comes into contact with our school and our students to share this commitment. It doesn't have to be complicated, but just something like that will satisfy the Office of the Children's Guardian that you are demonstrating child safe standard number 1. So that's an example. Child safe standard number 2 and 3, how are you involving your students in this conversation about child safety? How do you get that student voice? Do you ask them through a student survey? Do you do workshops? Every single school will be doing this slightly differently, but we need to involve our students in this conversation. Your students will be able to tell you where they feel safe or unsafe in your school. A really effective way to do this is through student mapping. Give them a map of your school, and you have an amazing campus here. And doesn't have to be a detailed map, a mud map would do, but and let them say, and ask them, where do you feel safe or unsafe? And what I mean by that is that there might be some areas that maybe aren't as visible, or that you may not realise, I don't know, behind the toilet block, a student might say, actually, you know what, that area makes me feel unsafe. So you're getting that information directly from your students. How do you involve your families and communities? Do you have a parent workshop? Do you have a parent newsletter? Do they know that you're committed to child safety? Do they know that your child protection policies and procedures are easily accessible? And going through, you will have different opportunities and ways of demonstrating how you're implementing each and every one of those standards. For example, today, Child Safe Standard number 7, tick, we are doing that. You know, we're training, we're equipping staff with the skills and knowledge in this area. Now, in terms of the implications for schools, because it's been embedded in the Act, because it's been legislated, the Office of the Children's Guardian will have additional powers to monitor, investigate and enforce those standards. So, you know, I can't see that happening to a lot of our schools, but it may. But really what that means is that if the OCG finds a serious failing by a school to implement the standards, they have some way of enforcing that, you know, either through compliance or through enforceable undertakings. We will have a little bit of room to move, you know, in terms of how the OCG will give schools, you know, a bit of space and time to get this underway. But as I say, if you do an audit and review of your child safe practices, you will see that you are already doing that. It's just formalising that process. Okay, I'm just going to pass you to Meg, who will talk about sexual abuse.
So I'm going to talk more about sexual abuse and go into a little bit more detail around this. Just as Maria said earlier, please, if you are... Sorry, I forget to do that every time. Please, you know, if you are finding it distressing, if you're feeling uncomfortable at all, please don't hesitate to take a break and please seek support from someone at the school afterwards. While we are emphasising sexual abuse and we do talk more about it, we do know that children experience all different types of abuse. So really our aim today is to create a child-safe culture that aims to prevent all types of abuse, not just sexual abuse. But it's something we focus on because I think it is a topic people feel less comfortable with, and there's really important dynamics to tease out. So I've got up here a definition of child sexual abuse. So it refers to a wide variety of behaviours, including contact offences such as fondling body parts all the way to penetration, and also non-contact offences such as voyeurism, exhibitionism, and exposing the child to pornography or other inappropriate sexual material. And as I said, the other reason why we emphasise child sexual abuse is because it is so prevalent. So these are the known statistics that 1 in 7 boys and 1 in 4 girls will experience child sexual abuse. But we really feel that this is significantly underreported, and research supports that, particularly for boys and particularly for adolescent males who have been abused by a female perpetrator. We know that the societal differences in perceptions of female offenders between, the societal difference in the way we perceive female offenders as opposed to male offenders is really significant. And we really believe that that really adds to, you know, a pressure on male adolescent boys to not report. And yet we know from research that boys experience the same kind of outcomes as girls do. So they also experience post-traumatic stress disorders, anxiety, depression, and all those risk-taking behaviours that come from being abused. In the past, for whatever reason, sexual abuse of children didn't get the publicity that it does today. It just wasn't talked about nearly as much. And although there's no concrete evidence of any significant increase over the past 50 years, it is now a topic that is more likely to be spoken about, and it's more likely to be portrayed in the media, but in quite a sensationalised way often. And yet, despite this societal shift in conversation, research continues to show that only a really small proportion of children actually report the abuse at the time. And an even smaller proportion of those what's reported actually goes on to be convicted in court. And we know that's because, you know, it's a very high threshold in the criminal court in order to get a conviction. And this is a child who may have tried to disclose multiple times in various ways, and they're dealing with all the associated shame and guilt and everything else that comes from their experience. So it often ends up being only their word against the perpetrators. it's very difficult to actually get that physical evidence. So we know, while I'm emphasising this to you, we do know that child sexual abuse occurs mostly at home. It occurs mostly in the child's home, with their families and with their communities. And the way that you're more likely to, have some experience dealing with child sexual abuse is if there's a child at school who's experiencing that at home. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the factors that might contribute to a child's willingness to disclose, or what might inhibit their willingness to disclose sexual abuse. First of all, disclosures like this can be really, really difficult for adults to manage. It's difficult to manage our own emotions and responses to the child. It's also really difficult in the sense that I think we worry that we're going to say or do the wrong thing, and that's partly knowing that the evidence is so critical when it gets to the time of court. However, and adults might want to just wait and see if they've got a little bit more evidence to act on, because it feels like such a big response to actually act on a disclosure of child sexual abuse. However, we know that the waiting and seeing, just gives that perpetrator more time to groom the child and actually get to a point of abusing them, or it might just be allowing that child sexual abuse to continue. So it's really important to act even when we're sitting in a grey space where a child may not have given us a really well articulated disclosure. Children feel safety in their bodies, so they might just be acting differently. They might be suddenly not wanting to go with a favourite uncle or aunt. They might not be wanting to do the things they did before. And it's really important that we pick up those things as well and are aware that that could indicate that something else is going on. And of course, the way children reveal information is going to differ. So it will differ depending on their age. You've got to be cognizant of, how old are they? How able are they to actually talk about these things? They might just draw something that looks, that you feel is not right, or they might just be feeling not right within their bodies, and articulating that something is not okay at home, but not able to say exactly what it is. And we know actually that at times children disclose in classroom situations. So if you're talking about healthy relationships, children might suddenly become aware that what is happening to them is actually not okay. Now that I understand that this is a description of a healthy relationship, my experience doesn't fit with that. And so you might actually find that children sometimes disclose in classroom situations. And of course, children are, there's a lot of research done on the other pressures that are stopping them from disclosing. And that can be that the perpetrator is threatening them. So threatening family is really common. The perpetrators have often done a really good job of grooming, as Maria talked about before. So they've groomed the family, they've groomed the adults, the other significant trusted adults in that child's life. And often the threats that they are making come true, because they might talk about the family being, broken up, and that's often what can happen. So as you can see, there's a lot of reasons for children not to disclose, and I guess what we are trying to do is we want to create a safe environment at school. It might be their only safe environment where they do feel able to disclose, where they feel listened to and respected. And so onto the how do you respond when a child discloses? And as I talked about earlier, obviously listening to the child or young person is really critical. And listening means not asking those questions, not asking the investigative questions, not trying to get all the detail about when, where, what happened. What you do want to know is, are they safe? So getting some information about when they might be seeing that adult next is great. But really what they need in that moment is for you to be able to actively listen to what they are able to disclose at the time. And once you have that information, then you can go on and report it. And it's up to police or whoever does that further investigation to get all that other detail. And that's part of really respecting the child and where they are at. So where are they at in terms of their vulnerability at that point of time? Where are they at in terms of their ability to go back and disclose what's happened to them? And then finally, just reassuring them that what they've done is really, really brave, that you do think it's important what they've told you, and you are going to keep them as safe as possible within the school, and you're going to tell the people who need to know about that disclosure in order for them to be as safe as possible. However, it's really important not to make false promises, because we don't know. We actually can't guarantee that that child is not going to be abused again. You're not in a position to do that. And we don't know what's going to happen if police become involved and start investigating, or DCJ start their investigations. So it's really about, in that moment, reassuring them that they are safe with you in the school, and that if they need to talk to you more or talk to someone else more, they can do that. And finally, as I said earlier, we know that sexual abuse occurs mostly at home. So it does occur in organisational settings, and we know that, from the Royal Commission, that's certainly something that was an issue and does continue to be an issue, but it is really much less common than children being abused at home. And often actually at schools, what we find and what our experience is investigating is peer-on-peer abuse, which tends to occur amongst adolescents more. So it's actually less from professionals such as yourselves, and it's more amongst the children themselves, but still relatively uncommon. And in public settings, obviously it's quite uncommon. Occasionally adolescents can engage in that, but not something that we emphasise very much, because it's not really common. So the stranger danger is quite outdated. It's not a common thing to occur. So as I said earlier, children have been really thoroughly groomed, and so have their families. And I think it's important to keep that in mind when we're talking with families and dealing with families whose child has been abused. 70% of first incidents do occur actually in the victim's home, and 63% of those will occur with someone else that they love and trust in the home at the same time. But they have been thoroughly groomed by perpetrators, and it's very uncommon for them to be aware of it. So it's also about supporting the family in how they can support the child, and they're going through their own process of grief, while still having to help support that child. So it's a huge thing that really, really, really difficult for families to manage. And okay. So after that heavy topic, are we having a break?
Yeah. Do we want
to
have
need
a
break?
Do we want to press on? 5 minutes? Yeah.
5 minutes? Okay.
Great.
Oh, it wasn't extended. Okay. We can't distribute them, unfortunately. There is a recording being saved, so we can send that, but like the PowerPoint itself, we can't distribute. What happened to that?
So we're all managing the site for the listeners to come back to these, and criteria will have to be which involves.
Did you get rid of Zoom?
I think I did. Let me just check that the process is dead. Everything's so tiny. I need to get new glasses because these ones are out of date.
All right.
So it just makes seeing things really annoying.
Yeah, Zoom's still there.
And
There's a lot of Zooms.
so many. And Oh, I can't open that. That's okay. I think I've ended what I needed to. Yeah, I'll just let them know that they can run
So
it.
if they do, if you present now, can they see their notes? Oh, you need to turn presenter mode on. There, that little tick. That one. There, yep. There you go. Now if you go from current slide, they've got another PowerPoint open.
Wait, is it two? Yep, we do.
Yeah. So you can get rid of that one.
Okay. That means I open up this one.
And then,
Presenter mode's on.
yep, from current.
Alright.
There you go.
Meaning.
So now they'll have their notes there.
Yeah, I'll just need to zoom them in a bit
Oh,
so
yeah.
I can see them. I don't know how much zoom they need. I might ask them.
Yeah, I reckon.
That should be okay.
Do you want to? Yeah, I can read that pretty easily.
Yep.
Okay.
I'll just get them to
Yeah.
let me know.
Yep.
Can they use this? Yes. Cool.
It's so so user friendly.
It's just one giant
Yeah,
button.
yeah. So it's
Okay.
Right. Right. That should work well.
I'm going to get everyone back in.
Okay, so
What was the Zoom thing? Yeah.
I have no idea what's happening.
Okay.
So anyway, we've now brought it here so that you've got your notes here. You
Oh,
can zoom.
perfect.
You can pinch zoom if you want to
Yeah.
have them bigger or smaller.
Yeah, that's okay.
But
no.
it'll run as normal
Yeah, that's
basically.
perfect.
You can also use this.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
whatever's
perfect.
more comfortable.
Yeah.
We
Awesome.
can unless you need that.
All good?
Yeah, all good. Fantastic. I am gonna ask people to come back.
It's here in case you need it, but it should be
Yeah.
okay.
Thank you.
Yes.
Okay, everybody. I might get everybody to sit back. Sorry, it was just an opportunity to stretch your legs and not a huge break. Thank you. If I could ask everyone just to take your seat, that would be fantastic. Now, a question that came up that a concept that I would like to clarify for you is whether so we've got the reportable conduct scheme that we've spoken about, and the criteria that is required in that space is in relation to an employee. Now, it will involve, the definition of employee is very broad. So I'm not just talking about full-time staff, I'm talking about your volunteers, your contractors, your part-time staff, your peripatetics. They are all considered an employee. So if there is a concern raised about an employee and they're a current employee of your school, it involves a child under the age of 18 and it involves any of those reportable conduct categories, it is considered an allegation of reportable conduct, a reportable allegation, and it can be reported on to the Office of the Children's Guardian. Now, you will note that I didn't say that it can't be your own child. So, for example, we did have a matter recently where a child came to a school with a facial injury, and that child disclosed that that facial injury occurred on the weekend in a domestic setting. It was actually the child's mother. The child's mother was an employee of the school. Now, I was talking to the principal of that school, and that principal was asking me, what do I do with that? And I said, well, that person is a current employee. It doesn't matter that they're a parent also. It involves a child. It doesn't matter that it was their own child, and it involves a reportable conduct category, assault. So you do have responsibilities under the Children's Guardian Act to report that, unfortunately, onto the Office of the Children's Guardian. So just be mindful of that it is quite broad, that it can involve incidents that occur outside of a school context, in a domestic setting, on the weekend. Now, the other just clarification I want to make is that in terms of mandatory reporting, that is separate. It's under a separate act, the Children's and Young Persons Care and Protection Act. We're all mandatory reporters, and those concerns are going to involve concerns about a child or young person, not an employee. So just so we've got that clarified, is that okay, Andrew? Yeah. Okay. So what I'd like to do now is talk about creating a culture of safety. Now, how do we embed this concept into practice? What does that mean? And before I go into the different elements of a culture of safety, I do want to just say that risk management underlines every aspect of a culture of safety. Now, what that means is that risk management is about identifying, assessing, and taking action to protect your students against any conduct that occurs from an employee, volunteer, or another child. So a school that is seeking to establish a culture of safety or enhance your culture of safety needs to understand how children can be harmed at school. What are the risks that can occur at school? And how are you going to know this? You are going to ask your staff, because there may be information and opportunities for harm that can occur that you won't know unless you have that broader consultation. You are also going to ask your students. Why? Because remember, Child Safe Standard number 2 and 3, we have to have our students as part of that culture of conversation of culture of safety. So remembering that it is really important to identify those ways that children can be harmed so we can address them effectively. All right, so we know that a child safe organisation doesn't just happen. It needs to occur at every single level of your organisation, your school. So everybody that is sitting here is responsible for creating that culture of safety. No, doesn't matter what your role is. Absolutely everybody has a part to play in creating a child-safe school. And we know that it's a dynamic process. It's ongoing. It involves a process of review, monitoring, and it's really important that it needs to be effectively communicated and understood by all your staff. So what we're doing today is absolutely fantastic. You've got a cross-section of staff here today. Everybody's involved. Everybody is hearing the same message. Okay, so in terms of the culture of safety, the AIS has created a culture of safety wheel, and we use this as a way of training schools to understand how to create this culture of safety. What are the elements, what are the aspects that we have to look at when we're trying to establish a culture of safety in our school. Now, we were doing this a little bit ahead of time, and so we've got 13 areas or elements that we look at, whereas with the Child Safe Standards, we've, as you can see, we've only got 10. So I'm just going to put them up on your screen, and I'm just going to take a couple as examples. I'm not going to have time to go through every single one, but just so you have an idea. Now, I mentioned before how important it is to have that really clear commitment. In terms of values and behaviour, we know that this varies across the independent sector, but one common value across all schools should be that commitment to keeping children safe. So child safety should be of paramount importance, and it should be clearly articulated to everyone that comes into contact with your students and your school. We know that leadership, strong leadership, is so critical to creating a culture of safety. And when I say leadership, it's not just about your principal, it's about buy-in from your school governance, from your executive staff, from your managers. So we really need to have that strong leadership so our staff and our parent community have confidence that this is really something that we are committed and serious about. You know, child safety is a key consideration in our school, along with our Christian ethos and philosophy. That's what we want to see. Culture of reporting is one of the most critical aspects of creating a culture of safety. Everyone should understand what concerns, no matter how minor or serious that concern is perceived to be, needs to be reported on in terms of a student and also in terms of the behaviour of an employee. How do I report that? Who do I report that to? We should know those clear reporting lines. And we should understand that if we do raise a concern that is serious, that we're going to be supported in that, that it's going to be confidential, that appropriate action is going to be taken, and that we understand it's going to be a supportive and positive process. You know, this isn't about getting your colleague in trouble or, you know, dobbing on a colleague or mate. This is about creating a positive reporting culture in your school. And why is that? Because we want to keep our students safe and we want to keep our staff safe. We want to make sure that we're not putting them in a compromising situation when an allegation is raised. Another key area, which is what we're doing today, is, for example, regular training. Now, your regular training is just that. It has to happen, you know, on an annual basis. It doesn't matter how you decide to do it. It can be face-to-face, online, you know, online modules, however you decide to do it. It just needs to occur. And the reason why regular training is so important is because everyone needs to be aware of how to identify risk of significant harm. You know, how do we identify that a child might be getting abused or neglected? Do we not understand that if a child's behaviour, as Meg mentioned earlier, suddenly changes, that might be a flag or a trigger that we need to explore? You know, what do we do if we see a child coming to school without food, or what do we do if we see an injury? So we need to be able to understand how to identify those risk concerns for students. And we also need to understand how grooming works. What is sexual misconduct? Because if we don't understand those concepts, we're not going to be able to identify and report that on. We're going to miss that opportunity. And you know what? If sometimes we find that if that behaviour in relation to an employee is interrupted early, it can really make a huge difference. It can mean the difference between a child being harmed and a boundary violation occurring. So we really want to make sure that we're having that regular training, that we're raising that awareness, that everybody is aware of what to do. Now, I'm just going to mention one other one. Your audit and review is a good one to mention at the start of the year. You know, this is really about ensuring that you have a good sense of your child safe practices. What are your child safe practices? Do we have any gaps in any area? If you look at that wheel, you might think we are all over our deflection strategies. Working with children, check, tick. You know, policies and procedures, tick. Safer recruitment, tick. But we might need to work on our regular training, or we might need to work on our child participation and parental engagement. And that's fine. That's what we want to see our schools do. So take some time to review your child safe practices. Take some time to see where your gaps are. And, you know, if you're doing a particular area well, why are you doing that particular area well? So that is going to help you understand how to implement those child safe standards, because these elements directly link to the child safe standards, and we will easily be able to demonstrate our how we're implementing that. Sorry, I talk with my hands. So that's just a couple of examples. As I said, I'm not going to go through every single one. So let's move on to talking about our crossing professional boundaries. Now, when I say professional boundaries, what do you think a professional boundary is? Just throw out any ideas. Acceptable behaviour between adults and children. Absolutely spot on. A professional boundary is often a tool that we say guides your interactions with students. A professional boundary is what helps you when you come to school in your professional capacity. How am I going to interact? What are the expectations of my school in relation to how I interact as a professional? But we know professional boundaries occur on a spectrum. So we have some that are very clear. We don't get into sexual relationships with children. But all along that spectrum, there are grey areas that are harder to identify, that are not so black and white. And so we need some really clear guidance from our school. And what is going to give you that guidance? Your code of conduct, your child protection policies. So your code of conduct, you should know that document inside out, because that is what is going to give you the guidance about all sorts of areas in your school. You know, what do I do about transporting a child? What do I do about communicating with a child? So hopefully that's something that you are able to easily access, that doesn't sit on your shelf and collect dust. But, you know, that is what is going to guide you. And as I said, we know that the reportable conduct scheme is a 24-hour, 7-day scheme, and that it affects you outside of a school context. So we should have that really clear guidance. Now, Professional boundaries are also affected by perception. So what I think is a professional boundary is going to look very different to what Andrew thinks is a professional boundary. Why is that? Because we're different genders, we have different experiences, different age. You know, I will bring a whole different world experience to what Andrew has. So it's important that we have that clear guidance. Everyone's going to come to school with a whole different range of experience. And so we need to make sure that we're clear, that we can clearly guide our staff around professional boundaries. Now, I'd like to put this slide up as a visual reminder of what I'm talking about and expand a little bit more. So on the left-hand side, we've got the green tile. This is your appropriate boundary. This is where most of us will come to school and we will sit in the green tile, in the green area. This is when our employees are abiding by our code of conduct, our policies and procedures, our job description. You know, 99.9% of the time we are there. We are professionals, we know what we're doing, we come to school and we interact in an appropriate professional way. However, we are all human, and human nature dictates that sometimes we may have had, I don't know, a car accident on the way to work, an argument or something else going on at home that affects the way we behave when we come to school. And we may say or do something that is outside an appropriate boundary and we cross over into the amber zone. We've crossed a boundary. And I'm not going to sit here and say that's never going to happen. It will happen. However, most of us will have enough self-awareness to realise, oh my gosh, I shouldn't have said that, I shouldn't have done that. And we can pop ourselves back into an appropriate boundary, a safe way of interacting with our students. Now, where we have a problem is where we see staff that are continually crossing over into the amber zone on a regular basis, or a staff member that lives there. And why is that problematic? Because that creates opportunity. It creates opportunity for harm, for that person to then easily transgress over into a boundary violation. And when a person crosses over into a boundary violation, that is when children, students are harmed. And so what we want to see is we want to see our schools with a really strong positive reporting culture, so we're able to guide people back into that safe green zone. We may see someone in that amber zone acting outside of the school expectation or acting outside of code of conduct, and they might just need a tap on the shoulder to say, hey, do you realise that's not what we do here? Or that's outside of our school's expectation. And that's all, that's maybe all that's required. Or they may need some extra guidance or training from an executive to guide them back to the safe zone. That is okay. That is our school working well. A positive reporting culture, strong leadership, courageous leadership, and positive staff culture that is going to raise those concerns. The other thing to mention is that what we want to look for is behaviour. So it's not about individual characteristics. So it's not what I know about Megan or John, it's about how they're behaving. What is their behaviour telling us? That is what's going to raise red flags. So if that person is interacting or behaving in a way that is not appropriate, that is that we want to report that on and ensure that our principal, our executive staff are aware of that. We want to interrupt those behaviours as early as possible. Because a person who's seeking to do the wrong thing towards a child is going to look like you and I. You're not going to be able to walk into a room like this and go, right, you and you are a risk to a child. It doesn't work that way. They are going to look like you or I. And often they don't come into your school with that in mind. They haven't come in as a motivated offender. What happens and what we see in a school situation, in a school setting, is situational offending. The person who is our boundary violation person, who keeps heading into that boundary amber zone, boundary crossing amber zone, and all of a sudden they form a connection with a particular child under a particular set of circumstances. Often they have their own vulnerability, and then what we see is a perfect storm occurring where they've all of a sudden crossed that boundary and a student has been harmed. So don't look for particular characteristics. As Meg mentioned, we're not looking just for males. Females can offend against children just as much. We have that notion that they're our nurturers and carers, and we are. However, we can't be blinded or naive to the fact that females as well as men can offend against children. So we're not looking for a gender, we're not looking for an individual characteristics, it's the behaviours. That's what's going to be our red flags. So moving on to our sexual offence and sexual misconduct, I'm not going to spend too much time on this because Meg did mention it earlier, but it is important to understand in terms of crossing professional boundaries. So sexual offence and sexual misconduct definition is now a lot more narrower. Sexual offence, pretty clear. If we see that happening, we are going to know. You know, if we see sexual touching of a child, if we see child grooming offence, more often than not, child abuse material, we're going to know that's occurring. That's going to be reported straight on to your police, and that action is going to take place. Now, in terms of sexual misconduct, the reportable conduct scheme has narrowed that definition. So what we see now is that we have to have descriptions that are very sexual in nature, conduct that is very sexual in nature. So the definition is up on your screen, and there's some guidance that the Office of the Children's Guardian provide. So for example, descriptions of sexual act without a legitimate reason to provide that description. I don't really, in the whole time that I've been doing this type of work, have many contexts where a teacher or an employee, an educator, needs to be talking to a child about anything related to sex or a sexual act or anything like that. There have been times when context has been applicable, but more often than not, if you see that occurring, if you hear that's happened, it is going to be something that will land in sexual misconduct category. Sexual comments, conversations, communications, that's obvious. And obviously any other comments expressing a desire to act in a sexual way. So what that means is that now, as Meg mentioned, crossing professional boundaries no longer sits under sexual misconduct category unless the behaviour of that employee is sexual in nature. It doesn't mean that we don't act on our crossing professional boundaries allegations. We still have to take action in relation to those because we know that crossing professional boundaries allegations often precedes sexual offences and sexual misconduct allegations. So we need to be really sure that we're conducting thorough investigations when we have crossing professional allegations to make sure there is no sexual behaviour sitting under that. I'll give you an example. We had a case where a teacher was communicating with a student via email for a long period of time, excessive amounts of emails, over 100, all times of the day, 2 o'clock in the morning, you know, late at night. That allegation came to our office and we were assisting the school. Now, the nature of the communication was fairly personal. The teacher was talking about being drunk. The teacher was talking about personal information that was of a personal nature. But there wasn't anything explicitly sexual. So we advised, look, it's definitely crossing professional boundaries. It's definitely a breach of your code of conduct. We don't want to see that teachers acting in that way. Make some inquiries, do a workplace investigation, and, you know, off they went. Now, in doing that, further information came to light from the mother of that student, where they found a card that the teacher had provided to the student that was very sexual in nature and was clearly stating how the teacher felt and what the teacher wanted to do with that student, along with a present. And so the school contacted us again and said, look, this is what we've got now. And that immediately, because the conduct is now sexual in nature, flipped it over to a sexual misconduct allegation. So we just have to be cognizant that, you know, crossing professional boundaries might be happening, and there might be further serious conduct happening underneath that. So we do have to take action to ensure that we're exploring that. Now, I said when I started, this is about protecting yourself as employees. So how can we protect ourselves? I'm just going to put up on your screen a few questions, very, very simple questions, but very effective. How might this interaction be perceived by others? Am I treating this student differently to others? Can I achieve the same outcome through a different interaction? Would I do or say this if a colleague were present? Would I condone my conduct if I observed it in another adult? And what guidance, critically, what guidance would my employer give me in this situation? It is okay to ask for guidance. It is okay to ask for further advice, information if you're not sure. If you're doing something that you think, I really don't know what I'm expected to do here, please be transparent about it. Transparency and accountability is going to keep you safe as an employee and the students safe. So the more your principal, your executive staff are aware of what you're doing, you are going to be safe in that interaction. And so I'm not here to say you can do this or you can't do that. No, what I'm here to tell you, one of the key messages is think about what you're doing, and are you doing that activity or that interaction in the safest possible way? That's the key. So, you know, whatever it is you're doing, are we doing this safely? Are we keeping our employees safe, our staff safe, equally as keeping our students safe? All right, what I want to do now is I want you to think about your code of conduct and any other guidance that your school provides in this area, and we're going to have a look at some case studies. I'm going to put it up on your screen, and I'd just like you to take a couple of minutes to read the case study, and then I'm going to ask for a volunteer from the junior school, and I'll put up a senior school one as well. Now, remember, this exercise is about exploring those grey areas. You know, often these scenarios are not black and white. And what we want to do today, Megan and I, is just to create an opportunity for you to raise those concerns and have that discussion, because that's what's going to help you. Have a read and then think about what concerns you might have in this scenario. Okay, I'm just going to read it out for the people at home. Junior school scenario is Miss Robin is an experienced junior school teacher and she has been at the school for many years. Miss Robin has a reputation for being brusque with junior staff and with the children. Some parents have expressed concern about her demeanour. You are new to the school and you notice her grab students by the wrist and pull them along, and they have trouble keeping up with her. You mention this behaviour to a staff member and she dismisses it by saying that is just the way she is. One day you see Miss Robin grab the arm of a 7-year-old girl and she falls. Miss Robin yells at her, tells her she always takes too long and tells her she is naughty. You see the student crying and she says Miss Robin is scary. What are some of the concerns that jump out at you? Yep, the school's acceptance of that person's conduct and situation. Really good point to make, absolutely. You know, sometimes we see that there is difficulty in reporting because that teacher might be more senior to you, might be more experienced. There are barriers to reporting. A lot of the barriers are, what's going to happen to me if I report this? What is going to happen to my colleague if I report this? Am I going to be responsible for that person losing their job, their career? So we want to flip that. We want to make sure that we have a positive culture of reporting at our school. So we are confident in knowing, no, that is not okay. That is outside of our school's expectations, and I am okay in raising that concern. I'm going to be supported. I'm going to fully be confident and understand that appropriate action is going to be taken. So very good point. Thank you. Anything else that jumps out at you? Yes. Absolutely. Thank you. The child doesn't feel safe. Remember when Meg was talking about how children experience safety and that they experience safety in their bodies? We've got to be really mindful of those flags that children also provide to us. You know, often as adults, we want to know a very clearly defined answer. We think in black and white, we're articulate. Tell me what's wrong. Why don't you want to do that? Why? And children just don't. They don't think that way, and they don't experience safety that way. They will say things like, I don't feel right, or, you know, that person gives me the creeps, or I don't want to do that activity. So be really mindful that sometimes you might not get a very clear disclosure about safety. There's other flags that will raise that child's not feeling safe. Okay, I might get Meg to do senior school. Yep.
Okay, so a Year 9 female student has complained that her music teacher has crouched down beside her on several occasions while helping her with piano. While crouching, he's rested his hand on her thigh. The student reported on one occasion the teacher moved his hand up and down her thigh. The student reported a weird conversation where the teacher offered she can visit his room to talk anytime and commented that the student has really changed and said, "You seem different over the last year." The student lost her father tragically 2 years earlier. The student's well supported by the school counsellor and her pastoral teacher. So what concerns can you identify in this situation? There's a lot, yeah. Sorry, did someone say something before? It's sometimes hard to tell where it's from. He's coming on to her, yes. So he's crossing that boundary quite clearly, right? There's physical touching, there's inappropriate, well, there's comments of an intimate nature. We don't know what a weird conversation means, but I'd be curious to know what that meant in more detail. What other concerns would you have for that specific student? Yeah, so she's more vulnerable. She might be seeking, you know, more support, and she might find it more difficult to understand where that line is if someone is being kind to her, or she might perceive it as kindness but creepy at the same time. Yeah, absolutely. She might just be disclosing that bit because she feels really uncomfortable with whatever else may have happened. So definitely there could be a lot more under what she's disclosed. There could actually be a lot more that's happened. And yep,
I'm just going to jump in there. And remember, as Meg mentioned earlier, that most students will see school as a safe sanctuary, you know, and at one point in your career, you're going to be it. You're going to be chosen for a student to disclose to. And we've got to be ready. We can't be afraid. We've got to be ready to take that disclosure. And because that might be the only opportunity that child has to not only disclose, but to really keep that child safe.
So what would you do in this situation? I mean, I think it's quite clear everyone's, you know, understanding this is not okay. What are we doing? What's our first response to this? Sorry, say that again. Yeah. And it would be looking at this particular music teacher. So he's clearly had this opportunity, hasn't he? So we'd actually be wanting to think on a school-wide level too, how did he get that opportunity? Does he have the opportunity with other students? And be really acting quickly on that and to put those boundaries back into place. All right.
I think we've got time to do one more. Yeah. Oops. Is that one? Yeah. So we've got a scenario here where you have just walked past the front office and you notice Mrs. Smythe with 3 students and each of them is taking turns to sit on her lap. You think this is unusual, but know that she's very caring and professional office employee. Later that day, as you are leaving, you notice Mrs. Smythe with Max waiting outside the office with him on her lap. She has her hand on his bottom and is rubbing him. When she sees you, she waves and lifts 4-year-old Max off her lap and comes over to you. Mrs. Smythe has worked at the school for more than 20 years in various administrative roles. What do people think here? Crossing boundaries, absolutely, yeah. What else jumps out at you? Yep, the fact that she gets up and moves the child when another person is there. Yep, absolutely. I think that's a really good point. Demonstrating that, you know, is she cognizant of what she's doing? Is she aware? Is this something, or is this something that perhaps she's in that amber zone and needs a bit more guidance? What else jumps out at you? Yes, absolutely. Really good point. She's been there for 20 years. What is the school's protocols, as this young woman mentioned? Really good point. You know, we've been talking a lot today about culture of safety and creating a culture of safety. Now, yes, that's a valid point, because what was happening for that employee if they've been there for that amount of time? You know, are they aware that things have changed? Are they aware of what your expectations, what the school's expectations are now? And that's why earlier I said, you know, policies, procedures are really great ways of keeping your students safe, but they're not the only thing that you need to focus on. We really need to focus on our values, behaviour and our culture as a way of keeping children safe. It needs to be something that is lived, a lived experience at your school. So you're right. So this employee may, you know, not be aware that, hold on a minute, you know, that is not on with our culture at the moment, you know, our culture of safety. And this ties in with ensuring that we do what we're doing today, ensuring that when you have new staff come on board, that you take that opportunity to induct them into your school's culture of safety, that this is a contemporary conversation that occurs, so everybody is aware. There is not going to be opportunities like that to not be sure what is your culture, what is your school's culture in terms of child safety, in terms of child protection.